Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Untrivial Podcast. My name is Allie Nelson. This week, I have with me Chris Marshall. He is a social and behavioral scientist drawing on diverse experience in investment management, futures work, and psychotherapy. He's also a TEDx speaker and the author of Decoding Change, Understanding What the Heck is Going On and Why We Should Be Optimistic for Our Future. His core focus centers on the profound benefits of playfulness in fostering creativity, curiosity, and collaboration in a world that is in constant change. Today, we discuss how stress affects our decision making, how to best navigate stress in times of change, the pause, play, move method, and so much more. Don't forget to check out the solo moment at the very end of this episode, last 10 minutes, where I share my own thoughts and feelings on the conversation. As always, if you enjoy this episode, please feel free to leave a 5-star review or share with a friend. And with that, let's get into the episode. Chris Marshall, thank you so much for being with us today. How are you doing?
I'm extremely good. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me on.
Oh, my pleasure. Well, I'm so excited to get into your book and talking all things change. But first, I just wanted to hear a little bit about your background and how you got to where you are today.
I think it's always the most daunting question, actually, because I wear so many hats. I am definitely one of those people who I kind of identify as multi-passioned. That's probably the easiest place to start. For a long time, I had strands of my life which I didn't know how would come together. That's probably the easiest way to put it. So today I kind of wear three main hats. I'm a professional futurist, so I look at how the world's changing, how trends and mega trends are not only kind of converging but accelerating change in society. I also am a behavioral scientist, so I'm fascinated at how does that change? How does uncertainty affect our decision making? And then the other hat that I wear is a psychotherapist. So I work with individuals to essentially help people who they might be suffering from anxiety or stress or trauma or addiction. Quite often, we actually see all of that change going on around us, reflecting in people's well-being, not just affecting their decision making. So that's kind of very broadly the hats I wear. I've also spent a lot of time within the investment industry, where again decision making is pretty crucial, and you get to test decision making in a very high stakes environment.
Mhm.
So yeah, I wear lots of different hats, and I bring them all together in this modern world we live in, which I call not just disruptive but radical social change, and we'll probably dig into that through the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. What a cool convergence of different things that you focus on. And I absolutely believe that, if people are coming to you to talk through anything in therapy, a big piece of that would be all of the changes that are taking place in people's lives. That comes with so much anxiety and excitement and, relational kind of domino effects that happen with change. So you must see a lot of that.
Yeah, I think it provides people with context as to why perhaps they're feeling so stressed or fearful about the future, because our brains hate uncertainty. I mean, that's the bottom line. Uncertainty is kind of equals death to our brain. It will do almost anything possible to find certainty, even lie to us. Or if it can't find certainty, it'll paint an extraordinarily bleak picture, because at least some picture's better than nothing.
Yeah.
And we certainly see that around us today. There's an awful lot of anxiety about the future. And this isn't me saying that we don't have hurdles as a human race. We do.
Hmm.
We certainly have some obstacles to overcome. But when we actually step back from this, I think one of the things which stood out for me when I was researching a lot of the work that went into the book Decoding Change was just humans' ability to be innovative and creative and adaptable. We are the most incredible creatures that we can pivot when we really need to, but there's a kind of a caveat to that. We can pivot and we can play and we can change things around when we're at our best.
Hmm.
And when we're completely consumed by stress or engulfed in an emotion, we actually go the opposite way. We become fragile because we're rigid. And so there's these really kind of interesting things which happen to our thinking, depending on where we are on that stress scale. So yeah, it all comes together. It is. It's for me. It's so important to understand how the world's changing, but perhaps even more so, it's more important to understand how we navigate it from our own biology, our own neurology, our own thinking.
Totally agree. We are like pattern recognition machines at our core. Absolutely. And interesting point you brought up about when stress is too much. I guess I'm curious, being a futurist, have you seen nihilism on the rise? I've heard things that are kind of around that people are feeling a little bit bleaker about the future and the younger generations. Is that something that you've seen in your research?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's actually quite consistent that it's not just unique to our era. It's we would think, oh, it must be that the outlook of, let's take carbon emissions or whatever it might be that's causing that anxiety. We kind of go, oh, it must be unique to our time period. But if we look back, whenever there are huge upheavals of society, of kind of societal philosophy, if we like, then there are typically that kind of anxiety rises in that nation or that group of people or kind of that collection of people if it's just a locality. So we saw that at the start of the Industrial Revolution. I mean, people were rioting in the streets, trying to tear down machines and factories and everything else. And we see it again today, that it's an understandable reaction to what's going on because the future is uncertain. And the more uncertain it is, the more we try and cling to something. And sometimes that something can be a negative. It can just be our brain spinning, going, oh my word, I can foresee all these problems and I can't see any simple answers. And therefore, you paint this darker and darker picture.
Do you think, because we are also so connected at this kind of time in life, and you know the news 50 years ago might be completely local to me, but now I can see what's going on in every single corner of the world. Do you think that contributes to that stress, because now you're not only thinking what problems are local, but you actually get exposure to all of the challenges across the globe, which is way more catastrophic for a lot of people.
Yeah, it's like turning up the amplifier button, isn't it? It's just
Mhm.
if you're feeling something, you can almost guarantee to find at least another group of people who feel exactly the same. So you can actually get siloed as well. And the internet's extraordinarily good at doing this. It puts you into a bubble. All your search history now starts to conform to this, and what Google will show you then starts changing based on it. And I mean, it's when you actually start digging into it that you do find that you start to get cornered by your own thinking and find other people who are supportive of it. And sometimes that's great, but there are other times where it isn't. And your point of kind of does it amplify things? I think we probably saw that most clearly, and there's some lovely scientific papers on this about the great toilet paper panic at the early COVID era,
Yeah.
um, where there was no particular reason why we should be rushing out to buy toilet paper
Yeah.
other than the fact that everybody was, and it was all over social media. And if you don't rush out, you're not going to have any.
Right.
I mean, it's a silly kind of like look back, but it makes a point that social media really does skew how we see things, and it can amplify our deepest emotions. And if we're somebody who's potentially kind of doesn't really cope very well with rapid change or uncertainty, then that can be massively triggering.
Yeah. I think it's so interesting to study change because it truly is the only thing in life that is constant. Like, there is constant change going on in the world and also over the course of your life, your experiences, what you're doing with your time. And so, I guess a main question I have is, are there seems to be more productive and less productive ways to think about change, but what are those ways? Like, what's a good way to think about change? What's a not so great way to think about change?
That's a great question. I mean, for me, a lot of my work now centers around what's optimal from a decision making point of view. And I've come at this from two different angles. The first one is, where do we have the most creative, abstract thinking? Because if we think about change, what we're asking ourselves to do is to be adaptable.
Right.
That's essentially what it comes down to, because otherwise the environment around us changes and we stay where we were, and that's not great. I mean, we don't need to kind of elaborate that point. If everything else accelerates and you stay still, there's a problem. And so it's about being adaptable. And this is where we start to come into some of the most incredible human qualities. We come into things like curiosity, because curiosity is now about, well, what does this mean? Or where is it heading? Or what can I learn? Or, I mean, there are thousands of different of permutations of curiosity. Then we get into creativity, which is making something new of a new situation. So Einstein had this lovely definition. We always have to be careful of Einstein's quotes because I think that there's about 99% of them are just made up. But I like to think this was his. And he called creativity combinational play. This idea that we combine two ideas which have never met before and smash them together, like almost two atoms meeting for the first time. And all of a sudden we get something brand new. And when we start looking at where we as humans can do this, we actually find it's linked to a state of our nervous system. So if we kind of think about stress, stress is this incredible response that our bodies have developed over thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years. And really the stress response is about getting us out of a imminent life-threatening situation. It could be a lion in front of our cave,
Fight or
or
flight.
yeah, exactly. Or freeze,
Yeah.
because freeze is a pretty useful response to a situation which is just completely overwhelming. It's kind of like, let's shut this down before Ali fries herself in this situation. And so when we kind of look at this, lots of different things change when we switch on the stress response. I like to think of it as like energy, and I tend to put this to clients as it's about energy. When we switch on the stress response, it's about finding energy to mobilize ourselves, because we start to shut down the creative centers of our brain, or the curious centers of our brain, and we become much more rigid to the patterns we know. We start to divert energy from digestion to the muscles and the heart. I mean, down to things like our skin tightens so that if we should bleed, we don't bleed as much. I mean, it's an absolutely phenomenal response. But when we come back to decision making, and your point of how do we move through a changing landscape, if what's great from a human quality point of view is this ability to have abstract thoughts, to not think in a linear fashion, then that doesn't happen when we're super stressed. It happens when we're calm. So I often ask audiences, if I'm speaking to an audience, I'll often just say, put your hand up when I say the location where you have your best thinking. And I tend to start with the office because it's just funny, because nobody ever puts their hand up. That we've created these centers that we call workplaces, and people are going, well, I don't think that great there. But
Right.
that's for another show, probably. Um, but as soon as you start saying locations like the shower, everybody's hand suddenly shoots up. And for some people, it might be the beach, it might be walking the dog, it might be on holiday. What you actually find is it's got nothing to do with the location. It's to do with how that person feels, where their nervous system is at that precise point in time. So when
Mm.
you're in the shower, if for you, you're thinking is the best when you're sat in the bath or on the beach, it's because you're at this very calm, connected state that your brain isn't racing. You're not chunking off a to-do list, because we could prove this by going, okay, you have your best thinking in the shower. I'm going to send you to the shower with a to-do list, and you won't have your best thinking. And so it's about learning to bring ourselves down to that calm state. And we've had some really wacky ideas in our modern society that we should suppress negative emotions. We should only have positive thoughts. And it just doesn't work. I mean, if you've ever been in a stressful situation and battled with yourself, you just get into a fight in your own head,
Yeah.
and it doesn't go away. So for me, it's about learning to teach people to pause. That's always the first step. And quite often it's about leaning into an emotion, not away from it, which can be scary initially, because you're like, oh my word, I don't like this negative emotion of sadness or guilt or grief or anger, whatever it might be. But if we kind of understand what an emotion is, And emotion is just the language of our nervous system. That's what we're starting to understand from neuroscience, is that our body communicates to our brain, but it doesn't do it in words. It does it in these kind of a sense and feeling, and our brain picks up on it. And in our modern world, we've promoted our brain to CEO of everything because we go, oh, it's amazing at solving problems. We've forgotten that it's also the creator of problems. And we've kind of neglected that felt sense.
Mm-hmm.
We've neglected everything from the neck down. In fact, there's a good joke, isn't there, about academics that they kind of go, oh, my body is just a transport mechanism for my brain. But if we are to learn to pause, if we're to learn to actually bring our state down and access creative, curious, abstract thinking, then we've got to re-engage. So that's kind of one of the massive things which I touch on both in. So I have a course called the PPM method, which is literally pause, play, move, which is aimed at decision makers to help them have the very best creative decision making, to find clarity in their thoughts, kind of all these things. But it also comes into therapy
Yeah.
because because this is where people become anxious and disattached to their body and kind of end up in these states where their brain literally is just on overdrive and they can't get to the end of the thought. So pausing is so important. And the sad thing, I think, is that a modern society has almost kind of looked at it as oh, you're lazy, you're stopping, you're not pushing forward, you're not being productive if you're pausing. And yet we need it, particularly in a world which is changing. Sorry, I feel like I've just gone on and on.
No, no, that's okay. No, I think there was so much amazing stuff you just mentioned. The one that really struck me was that emotions are an expression of our nervous system. I love that, and it's so true. It just rings so true for me. Even when you're angry, it's something that's coming up from your nervous system. You're sad, it's so much a reflection of your nervous system. I just love that you said that. And another thought I had when you were talking about where people think the best, is it typically in places where people are alone? Because I think there's also this idea that people think really well when they're together, but I definitely think my best individually by myself, but I don't know if that's true for everybody. What do you notice?
Yeah, I think there's a reluctancy of a lot of people to think by themselves. Um, and my view on this is that we have built out this society which is so externally focused. This is also, in my view, one of the reasons why we have so much anxiety and stress and depression and unresolved trauma, is that we have built this perfect environment where we believe it doesn't work in the long run, but we believe in the short term we can solve it by something outside of us.
Mm.
And that something outside of us could be endless Netflix, it could be another tub of ice cream, it could be another bottle of wine, it could be anything. But we find this kind of this coping mechanism outside of us. And what it's teaching us is continually to divorce ourselves from the inner landscape. There are actually some really fascinating studies on just how reluctant people are to sit with their own thoughts. I'm going to butcher this experiment, so sorry to whoever ran this. But they essentially sat people in a room with nothing in it. It was just an empty room, and they gave one group the opportunity to administer themselves a small electric shock. They were only going to be in this room for 15 minutes by themselves. And the researchers, I believe, were kind of thinking, well, no one's going to do this. It's 15 minutes. Surely people will just engage with their own thoughts for 15 minutes and put up with it. And it was something like 50% of people administered an electric shock just to do something other
Wow.
than nothing. So to come back to your point, yeah, absolutely. We do need to learn how to be by ourselves and to think by ourselves and spend time with ourselves, because that's the only time we go inside. And there's so much richness inside. But I believe that we haven't addressed so much that goes on in there that people are frightened to do it.
Sorry, it's also just like 20 times harder when everyone has the access to the entire world in their pocket every day, and you can pull it out at any old time and never deal with your thoughts. You've got screens on screens on screens, entertainment on entertainment. There's no, unless you are actively turning off your phone and going to journal, or turning off your phone and leaving it at home to really prioritize spending time with your own thoughts, it's so hard to do.
You're absolutely right. There is no need other than we have a human need for it, which eventually catches up with people. But there's no need in the short term to spend any time with ourselves. We can just be out there, as you say, on kind of this app or that social media stream, or we can just endlessly distract ourselves in this modern world, which I think is quite a dangerous thing that we don't fully understand or kind of even appreciate or talk about.
Definitely. So, going back to uncertainty, how does uncertainty affect our decision making? I understand it makes us more rigid, but what does that look like in practice, and how can we utilize that PPM method or something else to kind of break out of that rigidity?
Yeah. So how does it affect our thinking? Let's start there. I mean, really, uncertainty only affects our thinking. I mean, let's just clarify that for a second. It only affects our thinking if it does trigger a stress response.
Okay.
If you're not stressed about the uncertainty, which is the secret to all this, by the way,
Ah.
then it's you can just sit with the complexity. It's actually learning to be comfortable not knowing the outcome.
Mm.
And so if we look at this from the point of view of stress again, then that's where we typically want to be in control of things. We want to control the environment that we're in because we're feeling stressed. Your body, coming back to that idea of your body giving you signals, your body is detecting threat. And the brain's role in that situation is to protect the organism, to keep you alive, to keep you going. That's its sole role. We don't think about this in our modern world. We think it's to build a new hypersonic plane or whatever it might be. But that's essentially what it's designed for, is to keep us going. And so when our body throws forward this signal of threat, which is typically with an emotion, that's how it talks to us. It throws up fear or anger or whatever it might be. And our brain doesn't get kind of the chance to go, oh, interesting signal. What do I do with it? We just respond. Then that's where we can suddenly start triggering the stress response. And when we do that, this is again where all those kind of primal parts of us come to the fore, that actually cortisol in the brain starts to weaken the link to the prefrontal cortex, so the part at the front of our brain. That's our executive function. So we stop being able to look at things from different perspectives. It's all just about preparing us to get out of the situation, or to battle through it, fight through it, whatever it might be. So when uncertainty does change our decision making, it's to do with how we're responding to the uncertainty. Does that kind of
Yeah.
make sense? And when we have that stress response, what's really interesting is we can run through not just kind of how decision making changes. And I want you to think about this on a scale. It's not either on or off.
Okay.
It's not kind of I'm in the shower or fighting a lion. It's kind of like, if we put it on a 5-point scale, super stressed is number 5. 1 is in the shower or whatever your equivalent might be. But we live most of our life not at 1 and 5, hopefully. Some people, unfortunately, do live at 5 most of the time. And what happens is that our thinking and our decision making and our outlook changes depending on where we are on that scale. So it kind of somewhere in the middle, where most people spend their day, they're not stressed out, but they're busy. They've got stuff to do. That's a stress response. Okay, that's we're using our body to create energy to be productive, and we're setting ourselves a goal, and we're having a to-do list, and our boss emails us going, no, that isn't quite right, or whatever it might be. We can be social in that space if we think about how we relate to others, but we couldn't be intimate in that space. If you come home from work and you're stressed, that you can be social with your partner, but you can't be intimate with them. Like, so our whole relationship with the world changes depending on where we are in this stress response. If we're super stressed, you can't even be social.
Yeah.
You're either needy or distant or worse, completely disengaged or destructive. And our outlook changes with it too, because our outlook is tied to, again, come back to that survival response of why we have this functionality within us. When we're very low stress or when we're calm or joyous, we could call it, then actually we're optimistic, we're optimal. It doesn't mean we go around kind of with rose tinted glasses going, isn't everything just perfect? It just that we go, things will happen, but I know I can cope. That's optimism. Whereas when we're in this super stress response, then we move from that to completely pessimistic or destructive, because that's beneficial to this organism to look for threats, detect threats, because that's what our body's throwing up. It's saying, I'm detecting something in this environment which is threatening you.
Hmm.
Go and find it. So we put all our power into, well, where is this coming from? So essentially, when uncertainty comes along, if it triggers a stress response, then the whole connection with others, our whole outlook, our whole decision making ability shifts, completely shifts gear. And the amazing thing our bodies do, which is again where we struggle an awful lot, is our stress response can come on in a fraction of a second. So you'll know this from your own life where something has frightened you and you're not consciously aware of it until half a second, zero point 0.2 of a second later on. But there's an initial physical reaction. I don't know, I could be walking along the path near my home and I confuse a stick for a snake. I won't realize I've confused it until my body has already gone
Yeah.
like in this shock response. And then eventually my brain hopefully catches up and goes, Chris, it's all right. It's just a stick. And so while it can get there very quickly, the other amazing thing that happens is because of this property of neuroplasticity. So our brain is constantly changing. It's the only organ that essentially just continually develops through our life, and we can help facilitate that in a good direction. It's not just a kind of a one-way street. Because of that property, we actually tend to update ourselves to where we live from a stress point of view, where we live most of the time. So if you live your life at 2.5, 3, because you're working 90 hours a week and you're pushing yourself because you've told yourself that success is being stressed and serious, then unfortunately your body goes, well, do you know what? I'm going to help you because you seem to be here most of the time. I'll just rewire you. So this is now your set point. This is now the baseline.
Hmm.
And at that point, you really struggle to then come down to calm. And that's where we start to get into problems with anxiety and stress and overload and burnout and everything else. So yeah, so that was a fairly long answer to how does uncertainty change our decision making, but hopefully it kind of puts a bit more meat on the bone in terms of what's going on.
No, definitely. And it's so interesting you brought up the relational aspect because I can totally relate. And I think a lot of people can. It's like when you have a really horrible day at work, for example, sometimes you're like, I actually just don't want to go out anymore. So you had a plan and you just want to cancel now. Or your partner comes home and you're like, I just want to go to bed. It's like you completely shut off when you just have no more capacity to, be that kind person, be really present, because it's almost just like the only thing you can think about, or you just don't want to think at all.
Yeah, absolutely. And so often in those situations, we go straight to our head for the answer as like kind of, well, why am I feeling like this? And that tends to come with an awful lot of judgment. Like, I shouldn't be doing this. Like,
Hmm.
I know I've made plans and I know I should do this. So we then kind of get into this whole debate with ourselves. But actually, if you come to the body first for the answer, it's something that we're not used to doing in our modern society. Because again, as I said, we've promoted the brain to CEO of everything. That we just kind of go, well, if I want an answer to something, I'll go to my head. But if we go to our body, that's actually where we start to identify where am I firing right now? Like, if we just settle in and just go on a scale of 1 to 5 of stress, where am I? And you'll get the answer, and it'll probably surprise you of how accurate you can answer that. And that's just a compassionate process of going, I'm going to listen to what my body's, where it is. It's just, we're just finding out a snapshot of where is it firing right now. And then we understand it's our biology. It's not our head. It's our biology coloring the world around us, which makes it for a lot of people, it's almost that's quite reassuring that it's not something wrong with their brain going on. It's just that their stress state, their nervous system is currently at this set point.
Yeah. So let's go back to PPM, if that is the antidote, if you will, to a really negative stress response. So let's go through them again. So pause.
So yeah, there's three parts to it. So pause, play, move.
Mhm.
And to make great decisions in a rapidly changing environment or any high stakes environment where emotions can easily get involved if we're not careful or not aware. We've spent most of our time in modern society looking at the move. We love like KPIs and
Mhm.
goals and efficiency. And I'm
OKRs.
not, yeah. And there's nothing wrong with that per se, but we've kind of neglected the input of the decision making. We've just gone, well, just make as many decisions as we can or do whatever we need to do to get the output. And we've kind of put efficiency things into every aspect of our business, but not come back to going, well, how good is my decision making?
Mm.
The kind of I was having a conversation last night with a friend who's an accountant, and I was just kind of going, all these entrepreneurs put in place the accountant, the consultant, the solicitor to make sure everything is so watertight. And then they just rack up at the office at 9 a.m. and hope they're in the right frame of mind to make some good decisions and go, well, I feel stressed and tired at 5 p.m., so I'll go home again. And that's a good day's work. My background and kind of introduction to this, well, certainly performance psychology, was as a young athlete. I was actually a fairly anxious athlete. I'm neurodivergent. I'm old school Aspie, now on the autistic spectrum. Asperger's has been disbanded and put on a different spectrum. And I was a fairly anxious racer, and I had this incredible opportunity to work with a performance psychologist out in the States. And it was the first time I realized, or it was put to me, that ski racing wasn't just about physical being on the slope or being in the gym. There was actually a mental aspect to this. And as a kind of 14-year-old, this was mind blowing. I mean, now as an adult, I kind of go, well, where was I? Like,
Yeah.
how did I not realize this? But as a kid, I can remember just going, wow, okay, so I've got to concentrate on this. And so for the next couple of seasons, I spent hours and hours making sure that where I was and kind of mentally, I was in the right headspace to be able to train and perform. And then when I came into the investment world, they talk an awful lot about making great decisions, but then you see it. I mean, it's a caricature almost, isn't it? Within films, they go to the pub until 11 a.m. and then turn up at the office at 8 and hope that they can churn out some great decisions. And it's so true of so many entrepreneurs. They have a great idea, they find a market need, they have lots of passion, and then it falls apart because they're not concentrating on the decision aspect. They're not bringing their best selves to the table almost. So within the PPM method, we focus on that part of getting the mindset right. And it's actually very different to mental toughness or resiliency, which is typically borrowed from elite sport or military. So within the PPM method, the pause phase is really what we've been talking about, is training people to naturally tune back into themselves, to learn how to regulate, to have a better relationship with their emotions, so that it's not that you don't experience certain emotions, that you just flow through them. So an emotion should only last about 90 seconds to the peak of its kind of intensity. After that, the body's kind of done its job. It's rung the bell. It's given you the signal. And once you realize that it's just a communication piece, that emotion rising up in you, you can give it some space. You can observe it without judgment and actually with some compassion. And normally that's enough for it to actually start to melt. Is that you're not forcing it, you're not trying to master it or command it to go, which is so many approaches. So the pause phase is about learning how to come down to that scale, that kind of joyous, calm, level 1 stress, where we can access abstract thinking. Because if we're in an environment with a really high stakes decision, we want to be able to access that. Even if it's just for a minute where we just go, kind of, let's see what comes, let's be creative here, let's see different perspectives, let's be open-minded. And once you've done that, we can then move forward. So remember, the stress response is actually about energy. We don't have to go all the way up to level 5 to this kind of like rage. we can just tweak it very slightly. And if we tweak it very slightly, we actually come to playfulness. And playfulness is this optimal state. It's almost the optimal state of every animal. If you've ever seen a dog playful or a cat playful, it's just brilliant. It actually captures us as humans. We just stand and watch them roll around and chase each other and everything else. And as kids, we are encouraged to be our most playful selves. It's instinctive, it's second nature. And then unfortunately, just as we kind of in our modern society said that pausing is kind of looked upon with a very dark lens, it's seen as laziness or stopping or not being productive. Playfulness, if you're playful as an adult in the kind of the old school rule book, well, you're just not being serious.
Yeah.
You know, like that's what kids do. As an adult, you should be stressed and serious.
Yeah.
It's where we get the phrase that business is serious, or it's serious business. It's kind of, and we've got this all wrong, that playfulness isn't about being silly or irreverent. It's not even about playing a game. We are just given those tools as kids to learn what playfulness feels like. When we actually start to deconstruct what playfulness is, it's about having the ability to frame and reframe a situation. It's about something coming at you. So we're acknowledging that things can go wrong. Things do go wrong. That's the human experience. And when they do, it's it's our ability, if we're playful, to be curious about it rather than us engulf it and engulf us and take us down with it. It's our ability to frame and reframe something to diffuse social tension. It's our ability to take risks because we know that even though there's a fear within us, that's the way forward. Playful brings so many incredible qualities. And for me, it's that combination that allows us to navigate uncertain, complex environments with essentially without losing our head, because we're able to pivot. We're able to kind of just roll with the punches as they come at us. We're able to be our optimal selves. And if we go through it through that pause phase, that we come down to that calm, abstract, joyous state first, we come at playfulness with this incredible seam of thinking that is so rich that's where people have these aha moments, these breakthroughs, and we think that they only happen once in a blue moon, and it's just by pure chance or luck that we had it. It's not. That's available to us almost at any point. We just need to realize what's the thing which is driving it, and it's our inner state. And once we've done that, we can then access playfulness. And that relationship's actually really important because, again, coming back to how we're wired and put together, we can't access playfulness if we feel threatened or that we have a massive fear. So if we come at this from we're at level 4 or 5, I don't know, just like massive road rage or whatever it might be, it's almost impossible for us to suddenly flick to playfulness. Because playfulness, from an evolutionary point of view, is not what you want to be when the lion faces you down.
Right.
Playfulness is reserved for moments where you feel calm. And that's the crucial part in that sentence, where you feel. Because it's nothing to do with the external environment. Again, coming back to what we've been talking about already, we've been so fixated on the external environment. We believe it is the driver of the internal, that we go to the external for calm and solace, or at least distraction. And therefore, when the external becomes so stormy and fraught, we don't have the skills because we haven't developed them of stopping that coming in.
Right.
So it's about when we feel safe, we can then access playfulness rather than the environment has to be safe. for us to access playfulness.
And then once we've accessed playfulness, what's what does move look like?
Move is natural.
Move is do.
Yeah, absolutely. To be honest, I have never met somebody who's gone through that pause phase, who's found a breakthrough or an abstract thought or found a solution to the problem they're facing. They've brought their system up to a slightly higher energy state of playfulness, engaged in kind of collaborative, curious thinking and work, and then just gone, "Oh, I can't be bothered." It just doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Whereas we've kind of, because we've neglected the first part, we've kind of tried to, like, well, I mean, you just look around and you'll see so many words of like, oh, like hack this and kind of like 15 hacks for productivity.
Mm-hmm.
You're trying to force the outcome because you've not put in the time of the input. So in the PPM method, almost the joke is it's a two-phase system. um, because the move does take care of itself. If you get the pause and the play right, you're motivated intrinsically, the strongest kind of motivation to push forward.
Definitely. I want to talk a little bit more about different kinds of change, like macro changes versus micro changes. So, how might, some large societal shift, I know we're talking about the Industrial Revolution, for example, affect someone differently than, let's say, a job change or a move to a different state or country? Like those seem more micro, but do levels of change affect us differently, and are the approaches to handle them similar?
Yeah, I think the approach to handle them is the same.
Mhm.
It's about being able to, again, as we've been talking about, tune into ourselves and find calm within us, even if the storm is raging outside. And playfulness, again, like one of the qualities, as a kid, we know this. There doesn't have to be a solution. Kind of, I can remember getting those impossible puzzles as a kid for Christmas, and it's take me days, but there wasn't ever that kind of like, oh, this is stupid, I can't figure it, because it's play. And so we can apply that to what happens around us. That just because things are going bad doesn't mean that we need to find the final solution. It's about learning to sit with complexity, and just to, if we're patient and can wait, then opportunities will arise. So if we go all the way back to the Industrial Revolution, yes, absolutely, the Luddites had every single right to be outraged at these new factories that were taking away the kind of craft uh, market and everything that was kind of right, had been in place, and was now just being replaced by mass production. But what they couldn't see at the time was opportunities would arise that would actually progress humanity from this point, that completely new careers and jobs and industries would rise up. They could only at that point, because of the intensity of that emotion, see the destruction. And I think that kind of applies to us. So I gave a TEDx talk just a few months ago. And in there, I was talking about playfulness because there's a character in history who embodies this, I think, more than anybody else. And that's Sir Ernest Shackleton, so the adventurer and explorer. So he was obviously the guy who sailed off to Antarctica in the Endurance. The ship became pinned in the ice. I mean, he sailed through 1,000 miles of pack ice. We're talking 1900 here, wooden boat, 1,000 miles of pack ice. One day's landing, or one day's journey from the landing, the ship becomes stuck, just becomes completely frozen. They had to spend 10 months on those ice sheets. And then then the ship sinks, and they're
Oh.
faced with an 800-mile voyage in a lifeboat, which isn't even meant for ocean-going travel. But Shackleton was just this character who was able to rally his men and come back to that idea of what playfulness is, kind of framing and reframing situations. He did all the things which were entertainment, let's say, so kind of put on plays, dog sled racing, loads of other cool things like card games and
Mhm.
football matches and everything else. But one of the things which struck me, and I was kind of told these stories as a kid by my mum, was that whenever he was selecting crew, he called it, he looked for optimism. That was the number one quality. But he didn't mean optimism as you and me define it today. Because later on, like you read in some of his other quotes, he goes, kind of the ability to withstand the agonies of thirst with laughter and song. That's not optimism. Optimism's like, oh, it's sunny today, isn't it nice?
Yeah.
You know, surviving the agonies of thirst with laughter and song, that's way beyond. That's playfulness. And I think that applies to any shift. I mean, that's a life-threatening situation. Not only is it a life-threatening situation, he's taken crew members who he's entrusted his life to and now is endangering their life. And he was able to pull off the world's greatest rescue mission in the most hostile of conditions, I firmly believe, because of that principle of playfulness. And I think that if we can embody that, whether it's a micro change or a macro change, to be honest, it doesn't matter what the scale is. If it affects you personally and triggers that emotional response in you, it's a big enough thing to think about. We're talking about paradigm shifts in technology, as we've got AI, machine learning going on right now, or we've got I don't know, a rising water that affects just a few houses. It doesn't really matter. What matters is just what affects that individual. But the coping mechanism is this natural one that we all have. This ability to actually not allow the external to take control of our stress state and to be playful, which is about curiosity and just sitting with complexity.
I love that. That's such a great story to kind of prove that point. And it's so true. I think, there's so many situations that just pop up in life where there's nothing you can do, maybe in that moment, or it just sucks. And you can either feel and be really stressed and angry about it, or you can be like, yep, and how am I going to make the best of this? Or what do I have to be grateful for anyway, like in spite of this particular setback? Like there's so many different ways to frame what could be like a quote unquote like loss or, something negative that happens, but it's kind of all how you view and then what? So what do we do with that? And is it going to ruin my day, or am I still going to find a way to like be happy and kind of move through this? Yeah, that optimism times 10, what you were talking about with that explorer. It's so true. And I think the other thing that came to mind while you were speaking there is, not needing to have it all figured out or not needing to have a solution right away. And I love, like, there's a quote that I don't remember the exact words, but it's like, you don't need to look at the whole staircase. You can look at just the next step, and kind of breaking it down into something that feels small and achievable and doable can also relieve so much stress that comes with a potentially, mountain-sized thing you're going to need to do to get over that setback.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's lots of things, kind of one of the things which has just kind of come to my mind while you were saying those points was, again, we kind of have this illusion in our modern world that if we're successful, if we make it, whatever that means, then all of a sudden, all these bad bits of life, they disappear. And it's just completely and utterly false. It's part of the human experience.
Mm-hmm.
And bad things really do happen. They always will.
Yeah.
They will catch us off guard. And when we kind of embrace these deepest qualities of being human, we find that we're equipped to deal with them. But we don't put the practice in when things are calm. And so how on earth do we expect to be able to utilize them when things are tough? And that's kind of one of the big experiences that I've had is when you get people to practice just bringing their stress state down, when you get people to cultivate playfulness in their life, and there might not be this massive decision they need to make. They might not be at level 5. They might just be kind of like going through life at level 2 or 3, but they embed that practice and they embed that system into themselves so that when things happen, it doesn't make it easy, but they know what to do. And it's exactly the same principle when you look at kind of how they train astronauts to go up to the International Space Station. They don't just kind of send them up there with a book on resiliency and coping and go, I'll read this on the first night. there's tons and tons of practice before they even get there. And we have lived in a world which has been relatively calm and safe. Yes, it's had lots of kind of disruptions going on that we could pinpoint, but overall, the last few decades we've had it fairly smooth.
Mm-hmm.
The world isn't always that smooth. And I think it's allowed us to kind of forget some of the tools that we have within us that we now need to refine, re-enliven, kind of whatever the word might be. Yeah.
Yeah. It sounds cliche, but it's almost just that idea of getting comfortable being uncomfortable. And one thing I guess I'm curious about is, say if people want to build that skill of being able to kind of handle something, maybe just small discomfort. Maybe they're not ready to bring it into, the big stressful work thing. Do you have any practices or techniques that you recommend people try out in kind of these smaller, less risky environments?
Yeah, so I guess there's two things I'd offer. One is that you learn to check into your body, not your mind. Because remember, before we can get to that playful state, we've got to have at least found some sense of calm and safety. If we're still feeling threatened and unsafe, we can't access it anyway. So it's to learn to reconnect to the body and just experience. Mindfulness is great at this, but mindfulness tends to be, the way it's taught, all about the external again. Notice the trees and the birds and the sounds and the smells. And that's a brilliant first step, but we can apply the same inside of where's the tension? Where's the parts of us which is relaxed? And how am I standing? Am I tense? Is my fists kind of like clenched? Is my heart rate racing? Is my breathing in my chest or my stomach? Because when we're stressed, it moves up. And so we just learn to reconnect. So that's step one. And the other step that again kind of I've published stuff on which people can easily embed is I just tell people to take the 10 minutes playfulness challenge which I created. And in the 10 minutes playfulness challenge, it's literally just find 10 minutes in your day to do something playful. Just shake things up. It doesn't actually matter what you choose. It doesn't even matter if you in other anybody else knows. It could be that you just try and write some notes with your left hand. It could be that you sit in a park and watch others and pretend what other people are saying to each other and make it as hilarious and stupid as you want. When you start embedding it and you actively go out and just do 10 minutes of this and actually then kind of sit back and review it kind of at the end of each day, well, what did I do today which was playful? Studies have shown that actually we naturally start to embed the qualities of playfulness. So that kind of creativity, curiosity, collaboration into our lives that naturally kind of builds. So just by doing very, very small steps, we start to do this. Sometimes people find that they struggle or they hit a block. And sometimes that's a sign just that there's something underneath that needs addressing first. Again, because it's about this feeling of safety. If there's something blocking us, then it tends to be attached to kind of an emotion which just won't go, or a limiting belief behind it that just won't let us pass it. And so that's where I kind of say, okay, well, sometimes a bit more professional help can unblock that and help you just move forward. But normally those two things, tune into your body, don't have to force it down to level one. You can't force it down to level one. Just sit with it and just notice it and it will melt down.
Hmm.
And then the second bit is just build 10 minutes a day. 10 minutes a day of playfulness. You can encourage others to join you or just do it by yourself.
Yeah. Does doing like a sport count? Like, say you play frisbee, is that playfulness or is that a little bit too predefined as like,
I would say, yeah, for the 10 minutes playfulness challenge, I think it's cheating.
okay.
um, so, but you're used to, so before you can play frisbee, you have to access playfulness as a mindset. You couldn't walk in there with a clipboard and go, right, I'm ready to play frisbee, throw. It just doesn't work. You have to be able to get yourself in a playful state to play.
Right.
So that's the difference between playfulness and play. Is play is normally an activity driven, whereas
Okay.
playfulness is a mindset.
Oh, okay.
Um, so I'm going to say your frisbee is cheating for the 10-minute
Okay.
challenge, but it's a great learning environment. So absolutely, people who naturally do things which involve play already know what playfulness feels like. So playfulness, I mean, there's four types, or kind of four broad categories, and this comes again from some great research, which isn't mine, unfortunately, but by a guy called Rennie Proyer, I believe. And he defined that into these four categories, and probably be able to identify which one you naturally tilt or gravitate towards. And it'll probably be a lot to do with how your parents were and how they taught you to play. So one is lightheartedness. And in lightheartedness, you view life and work as a game. It's Everything's just a game. I mean, it's just easy. It's
It's
light.
just made
It's
up.
like,
It's fun.
yes, yeah, and just like, oh well, let's see if we can shake this one up today, or whatever it might
Yeah.
be. And then you get other directed, which is a really interesting style of playfulness. And those people who I'm always intensely jealous of are the people who can just change the direction of a conversation or a situation. They diffuse tension,
Mm.
but it's a reframing things. It's moving. It's suddenly changing the path. It's a really interesting type of playfulness. Then you get other. So we've done lightheartedness and other directed. You get whimsical. So whimsical playfulness tends to be around novelty. So it
Yeah.
could be that they observe weird things nobody else sees, and they just go, "Oh, did you see whatever it was, that clown running past there?" And you're like, "No."
Yeah. There's like a funny Theo Vaughn like clip of his voice, and it's like, do you ever think the wind is trying to tell us something that we don't know? And that always makes me laugh. Would that count as a whimsical
I think,
person?
yeah, that sounds like whimsical, absolutely. And then the final one that he kind of put in his model was intellectual playfulness, which is where you prefer complexity over simplicity, where you hate routines, where you just want the freedom to be able to find your own path and almost obsessively play with ideas,
Hmm.
twist them around and go, well, what's it look like from the other side? So there's all these different styles of playfulness. And as I said, we naturally tend to have one. I'm definitely more in the intellectual playfulness camp.
Mhm.
I'm very jealous of the other directed ones. I wish I had that social ability. But yeah, our job is to essentially raise our game in all of them, because when we add them all together, that's kind of total playfulness.
I love that. And I'm struck that it doesn't seem like, because when you say playfulness initially, people think kids, young, that's where your mind goes. But actually, when you break it down, it's not that way at all. But do you think people with children have an edge just because they might need to play a little bit more if they've got young kids?
I think they have a natural environment where it facilitates
Yeah.
playfulness, but they also have a trap. And the trap is that they, again, associate play with toys.
Right.
So, absolutely, they probably will be more playful. But if the association is just, oh, well, it's playfulness is about trains, or it's about Lego, or it's about whatever else, then they still don't learn the lesson of employing that into their professional lives, which is the area where we've completely banished it. And again, we seem to keep coming back to the Industrial Revolution today, but the Industrial Revolution really tried to get rid of playfulness. It was a command system where they didn't even want you to think. Just pull a lever, shovel some more coal, restock the frame, kind of whatever your task was. Whereas we've moved to a society and a place in the world where we have to be creative and strategic. We have to think outside the box. Even lower level junior positions in a company are asked to do an awful lot of those things by themselves. It's no longer just, oh, pull that lever and that's your job done. But we've kept the same management system, and we've chased the same efficiency that was the buzzword. Time management only came in during the Industrial Revolution or just after. Uh, and we try to keep all the aspects of that, and that's great. But we need to now make space for humans.
Right. I was just about to ask you because when you think playfulness in workplace, my mind goes to companies like Google or, places that you see that have all those fun things, or, games at work and break time, and kind of giving people that time and space to work their best. But that's not super common, nor do I think it can be in terms of the cost for some of those things, at least at that level and the way that they do it. But how do you, how, are you, and like, is your work attempting to kind of like hammer this point home in the organizational setting to be like, hey, this is how you're going to get the best out of your employees. This is how you're going to get the best work outcomes. Actually, it's not just, time management and OKRs. It's that space and that safety to be playful and come up with new ideas and fail and try again.
Absolutely, yeah. Because and there are so many examples of this. If you go back through history, and this isn't a recent phenomena. If you go back through history, the most successful businesses, certainly the ones who have innovated products, have somehow captured playfulness. Google's perhaps done it, to your example, done it the most visually by sticking slides and ball pits and things in.
Yeah.
But if you look at kind of some of the early kind of rocket technology around some of the kind of spaceships and kind of rockets and everything else, a lot of those early engineers were super playful. And in fact, there's a story where I can't remember which company it was, but they had this cohort of engineers, and they were the ones that came up with these incredible thruster engines. I'm talking about stuff I have no idea about, by the way.
That's okay.
They basically all retired, and they went out and they found the very best engineers from Harvard and everything else, and they came in and they just did not get the same results, and they couldn't understand they were employing people who were at the top of their intellectual field and academically super successful. And what they found was they just didn't embody that playfulness. They weren't as curious, they weren't as collaborative, they weren't willing to kind of go, oh, just try that, or look at it from multiple perspectives. They were coming at it from this single direction. Everything was mapped out and kind of planned out to the precise part, which I guess is important finally in a rocket.
Yes.
But in the initial
Still
conception
critical.
stage, and I think that's also the point, is when we're talking about playfulness, it's not like, oh, you either like come to my team or you go to like the linear team. It's linear thinking is still going to make up 90% of your day. Just the critical, crucial 10% is that ability to be non-linear, to be playful, to
Right.
be abstract, to see around corners. So we're not kind of going, oh yeah, completely just get rid of all of that kind of rigid nonsense over there. It has its place. It's really, really important. But the differentiator between those who just stand out and excel is that they know how to use the 10% of playfulness.
Yeah. And what I think of when you mention that is, that initial ideation stage, the first stage where you're figuring out, okay, what decision are we going to make, or what are we going to build, or what's that going to look like? That's the space for playfulness, because after you've kind of figured out that creative approach or creative solution, you can do some linear tasks to get it done. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. And it might take a few rounds of kind of like, oh, okay, this isn't working. Let's go back to the creative space.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, it's not either or. They work together, and naturally, as humans, we have this ability to flick between the two. It's just so much of our society has chased this rational, logical, deductive thinking, which has superpowers to it, but it's not everything, and we've confused that.
Yeah. Do you feel there's hesitation from leaders or management? And it might be this notion that space for play, space for creativity, space for that almost time to pause equals maybe not, productively using 100% of your time, or there's like a downtime where you're not creating outputs, and like that's the pull of, oh, like, do we allow for that? Because what if people take advantage, or what if they're not quote unquote doing anything? And it feels like there's a worry of risk with allowing it to happen, but if you don't, then obviously you're stuck with the non-creative thinking and not the best ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're absolutely spot on. I am up against a massive wall
Oh
for this,
no.
but thankfully, I mean, where I become optimistic on this is I have to say I don't really care about that side because I mean, thankfully, we live in a system where the most innovative, creative players rise to the top, and we quickly mimic what they do, or if we can't, we fall behind. So whether it starts at the top or it starts at the bottom, if it's a system which works, it will find its place. And I think the history actually says it does find its place already. We've just overlooked it. But as the world becomes more uncertain and disruptive and kind of just chaotic, it actually isn't the niche areas which need to embody this. This is now the general entrepreneur who is being asked every day to turn up to work and just go, the landscape's changed. The ground's been pulled from my feet again.
Hmm.
And it's like, how do we pivot? So we've always known these skills are really important because actually when you look at the most important critical companies, they've always had these wacky, incredibly creative sections to them. You know, you look at the early days of Apple, you look at the early days of we could cite so many companies. But the point is that they've known that there is this space for abstract nonlinear thinking, this playfulness space. But the general entrepreneur has been able to get away with just using linear thinking to get through. But now that the world is so disruptive, and we're seeing it in the stress stats, that just the general aggregate level of stress and anxiety in the human race is so high that the systems and tools we're using aren't working. And that's a double-edged sword. Come back to everything we've talked about. That means you're less creative. And we've got society going, you should be stressed and serious. So yeah, I do believe there are some barriers to this, but I don't think in a playful way, I don't think they matter because the best things rise to the top.
Yeah, and I think as much stress and change in our society there is, I do think there is a belief that innovation and disruption is so important. It's so critical. It's celebrated most times because it just makes life and a bunch of things easier for consumers and the market and people. So I think we're all on board. Maybe we just all don't handle it well in practice, right?
And I think that's, you know, one person's innovation is actually another person's disruption.
Yeah.
I think we also have to kind of acknowledge that the more playful and disruptive we are, actually, the more disruptive and chaotic the world can be, and therefore the better we need to embody all these skills we're talking about.
Yeah. What comes to mind for me is Uber and taxis. Like Uber, so innovative, so disruptive. There were, at least where I am, there were protests, there were all these things going on from the taxi drivers because they did not want to let Uber in. And,
Yeah,
it's better for the consumers, but now you've got a lot of people who have a very different opinion about what's happening. And what do you do with that?
yeah, absolutely, and that's where it becomes really interesting, isn't it? That that the natural reaction is to try and prevent change, but we don't live in a world which stands still. We never have. We never ever will. If we don't progress, if we don't move forward, we stagnate. And therefore, we can try and go, no, I don't like this. You might hate AI. You may, I don't know, kind of go, oh, it's going to destroy everything. It might destroy a lot of the foundations of what we know is true,
Hmm.
but in its place, something else is going to rise. And it's our job to make sure that thing that rises, we push towards it so that it's positive and bright. And I think that's kind of we do have to acknowledge that change does bring up massive. I mean, again, we've been talking about this whole time, but stress response, emotions, limiting beliefs, everything gets thrown into the mix as soon as you start shaking somebody's world. But that's the environment we're in.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Going back to you being a futurist, I'm so curious what trends or future states or things you see or predict. Tell us what you think for the next, I don't know, Do you do it in like decades, or what's your time horizon?
So yeah, the time frame that I tend to work with is multi-decade periods. For me, and there are lots of futurists who work with lots of different time frames, but for me, it's looking at kind of the trends and megatrends. They're really slow moving, but they have massive impact. So, I mean, probably the easiest thing is to give you kind of the model that I put into Decoding Change, which was just called this layers model, and it's got 6 layers to it. And the relationship is the top layers of this model move very fast, but they have almost no global impact. Whereas the bottom layers move extraordinarily slowly, but have huge impact on our lives and how the world runs. So the top layer is products. We're used to products changing every day. Under that is business. Businesses obviously update slower than products because they're the ones creating the product. Every now and again, we will get a shift in businesses. It could be a recession, it could be a new technology. Under businesses, we get down to the third layer, and that's infrastructure. That's where most of our media talks about. Infrastructure is technology. So our internet today is the canals of the 1700 or whenever canals were built. Showing my naivety here. But every about 50 to 60 years, we get this paradigm shift in a technology. Or we have done since the Industrial Revolution anyway. So we went steam engine, locomotive, heavy kind of steel and engineering. We then went into electricity, mass production. And then 1971, we come up with the semiconductor, which is the paradigm shifting technology of our era. And hey presto, we're like 50 years on, 52 years on. And we're now talking about AI and machine learning and robotics. Quite which of those is the game changer? Who knows if it is those. What we tend to find though with an innovation, if it's to be a paradigm shift, then it has to be able to be built on by others. It has to be a platform which others then build on top of. So if we think about the semiconductor, I believe that when they first conceived it, they thought there was about 7, 8 computers in the world that would use it, very low volume product. And now it's in everything from our Christmas lights to everything we're using here to record this podcast. And so others have been able to piggyback on top of it and innovate with it and create smartphones and computers and everything else. And so that's one of the conditions, is that it's easily scalable and it forms a new production system. So there's a few kind of things there that I've mentioned. If we look further on, then we've got, and we're now getting into sci-fi territory a little bit, but some very early signals is around things like nanoengineering, which could be kind of absolutely revolutionary in terms of medicine and design, clothing even. We're experimenting with an awful lot of things there. We're only down to the third layer. So if we start to go to the bottom of this kind of model, then the next one we come across is then regulation. And what we find is when we get regulation moving, so regulation becomes proactive rather than reactive, and there are lots of periods through time where this happens, is the societal philosophy changes really rapidly because it suddenly changes how the infrastructure is, what businesses run, and what products we can buy. And if we look one layer below that, that's where we actually get cultural philosophy. Now,
Mm.
this is a really interesting one today because normally, if we go back to kind of us living in tribes, the younger generation were taught the patterns and rules of life by the elders, and it was always passed down that way. There are lots of tribes where you can't even be an elder unless you make it to, I don't know, 50 or 60 years old. You actually had to be kind of have life experience. Now we're seeing that younger generations are influencing the purchasing and lifestyle habits of older generations. It's the first time in human history that I can find where we've got that bi-directional influence. And I mean, that's an incredible game-changing moment. But there's another layer below cultural philosophy, which is the one we're all waking up to. It's always been on the move, but we're waking up to it, and that's the natural environment. And when the natural environment moves, everything above it has to move with it. And so we see this kind of, obviously our planet has been through lots of different cycles of ice ages and tropical times. I mean, even the configuration of countries today is really only temporary, we have to admit. We like to think that the ground we stand on is fixed, but talking about uncertainty and change over a geological time frame, even the configuration of our world is temporary and is moving. And so I often find that that model helps people just kind of dissect where things are moving from and what's driving changes. And today, what makes this really interesting, and why I often say that the period we're living through today is not just another industrial revolution. This is as big as when we stopped being hunter gatherers and became a nomadic society. So 10,000 years ago, is that every single of those layers I've talked about, we see trends and megatrends on the move. Every single layer has a trend or megatrend which originates in it, whether we talk about rising sea levels, or we talk about this changing cultural philosophy, or we talk about the changing infrastructure, or regulation taking center stage. Every single layer is on the move, and it's all accelerating and combining. And that's why I have done all the work I have, I guess, because while we see people get stressed and anxious already and it's affecting decision making, I think where we're headed to is even more so.
Yeah, I think with all of those massive changes at every level, it's important to make the best decisions for our future because it's so impactful. Second to last question, what do you hope people take away from your books, your message, our conversation today?
I hope they just kind of sit and think about it. And because when you sit and think about it, I think it becomes quite obvious that we've just kind of distracted ourselves and not thought about our thinking. And yet it's so crucial. And in fact, this is where you actually start to see so many kind of lifestyle habits emerge, is just because we're not paying attention to the stress part. We're not tuning into ourselves. We're not kind of regulating ourselves. And so the takeaway is, I hope people just sit and think about it. And if they find that actually, yeah, they want to do something, then absolutely, it'd be a pleasure to work with them, whether that's through the PPM method or the kind of the psychotherapy practice, or just a book I've written. People can kind of choose how they access me, I guess. But yeah, it's just that kind of that curiosity. That's what I hope to spark. It's just a curiosity of, is there a better way than what we're using now?
All right. And very lastly, where can people get connected, learn more about you?
So probably the main place for me personally is LinkedIn, or my site, chrismarshall.uk. Or if they're interested in the PPM method, then that's got its own site, which is ppmmethod.com. But yeah, I'm around. I'm all over the internet, so people can find me fairly easily. But LinkedIn and my own site, if people want to reach out personally.
Amazing. Chris, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed this episode with Chris Marshall. We are back with another solo moment, and it seems only fitting to continue talking about change and stress. And I know that is a constant battle for so many people, especially when change, it feels like change you can't control. I think the biggest reason for me that that affects me is because control, for a lot of people, including myself, equals safety. I have power, I have control, I have a say about what happens next or what's going to happen to me. And when change is affecting us that we have no control over, it can feel really scary, really hard, and just like we are helpless or we don't have anything to fix or change or do about the situation. And while in a lot of cases that is true, the one thing that remains within our control is how we respond, how we adapt, how we cope. And I feel like that is such a big piece of being able to be one of those people who can take change in stride and be one of those people where change doesn't bring on that stress response, like Chris was saying. And so, how can we frame these changes outside of our control, or how can we frame our responses so that we feel like we can accept the parts that we can't control and really take in stride and optimistically the parts that we can? And I think to Chris's point, a huge piece of that, even that process, is pausing and evaluating and saying, hey, okay, what is within my control and what isn't? What about this situation is happening to me? And what about this situation can I influence, if anything? And there might be times where you can't influence very much. Accept your attitude, accept your thoughts, accept your beliefs around what's happening. I think one that people experience that could be really, really hard is something like a layoff. You have no control over that at that point. So, what is it that you can do to cope, to continue to thrive, to find your next step in stride, and to keep going? Is it pausing and saying, okay, I no longer have a role with this organization, but I'm going to take an hour today to update my CV. I'm going to take an hour today to reach out to 15 people in my network and let them know that I'm looking for a new role. I'm going to take an hour tomorrow to look at opened jobs and apply and really make sure my application is specific to that company, specific to the skills they're looking for. And so you can have control over some of those next steps. I also think even when it's a change in life that you want, that you chose, say, for example, moving to a new job or moving to a new country, it can still be hard to face change even when you know it's a good change. And I think it's so natural to feel stressed or scared about newness, about big shifts, because there is that element of the unknown and not knowing what to expect and not knowing what could or couldn't happen. So I think being gentle with ourselves, like anxiety and worry, is so natural with big changes. And there's nothing wrong with feeling a little bit of that. But if we can shift our mind frame to, all right, what are all the great things that can happen? Trusting our gut, trusting our intuition, and trusting ourselves that we made those decisions in the first place, trusting our abilities to be able to handle difficulties that come and arise in our lives. I think just tapping into that can really help center ourselves. And the way to do that for me, at least, is through journaling or talking with friends. I think sometimes worry and anxiety can bubble up and it might feel like it has nowhere to go when you're kind of just thinking it over and over in a loop. But to actually get those thoughts on paper, to get clear about actions you can take versus what you can't take, is so, so helpful to just kind of organize and center yourself when you are going through a change or a difficult time. So, my advice would be exactly as Chris said: pause and then turn inward, journal, take notes, really identify what's scaring you, what's making you nervous, what's within your control, what's not within your control, what actions can you take to improve your circumstance or make yourself feel a little bit better. And sometimes that might even be just a little bit of self care. Sometimes there is no action you can take that's going to completely shift the course of what's going to happen, but you can look after yourself. You can look after your body and mind. So maybe those actions are going for a walk in the morning to clear your head. Maybe it's going to the gym and moving your body, or making sure you're going to bed at a decent hour. The unfortunate but beautiful thing is there is so much in life outside of our control, and that can lead to really hard times, but it can also lead to these amazing opportunities and moments for growth that we never would have picked for ourselves or never would have expected. And so I just hope we can all center, stay optimistic, trust your gut, trust your skills, trust yourself, and lean on friends when you need to. Anyways, I hope this was helpful. I hope you have a great week ahead, and I will talk to you next week.